I found somebody who had written a research paper about the perfumery of the lower classes of the Caribbean in the late 18th century, and I got the exact answer that I needed 6 months after I published the book. I'm Lars Hedbor. I am the leading novelist of the American Revolution with 19 books in print. Each of my novels is based in a different colony or future state, and they all focus on telling the stories of ordinary people. So the reason that I focus on ordinary people is twofold. First of all, writing about historical figures is very difficult. I have so much respect for the people who write great historical biographies, biographical fiction. I've written one that was based on the life of a person who actually lived, and it was hard. And the real danger is that you do all your research as carefully as you possibly can, and you try to bring this person to life, and then 6 months after you publish, something else comes to light, and you realize that everything you wrote was wrong for one reason or another. So that's the first reason that I tend to write about ordinary people. The other reason is because they're more relatable. We aren't all George Washingtons or Thomas Jeffersons or Ben Franklins or even Alexander Hamiltons or Jimmy Madisons or whatever. In our daily lives, we don't necessarily have exposure to that level of society, that level of person in our lives. We go about our lives and do what we're doing, but we change history in doing that. And that's the thing that I really want people to take away from my books, is that you do not have to make it into the history books to shape history. And so my books really focus on people who, for whatever reason, either have their entire life changed by the revolution, which that happened a lot, or some little thing that they did wound up shaping history in a way that we can still see today, even if we don't have their names, even if we don't know who did it. We know somebody did these things, right? So I try to tell their stories. So as far as the great moments in history go, again, very few of us are present and take part in something that we look back at and go, oh my God, that was a great moment in history, right? Most of us see those things from a distance, and most of what we experience of them is, how does it affect my personal life, right? So that's the way that, for the most part, my characters experience these events. I do have a couple of books that actually do tie into some of the key moments of the revolution. I have a book where I have a character who's taken captive at the Battle of Saratoga. I have a whole book that explores the siege of Yorktown, which of course we all have heard of. It was the last major battle of the Revolution. We're all familiar with it, but very few of us have actually pondered what was that like to be there. What was it like to be dodging the American cannonballs in Yorktown? So I got started in 2008, and November of that year was National Novel Writing Month. And I'd always kind of thought, kind of feel like I've got a book in me. And then, I had this idea about exploring the revolution. The idea is that if you write 1,667 words every night or every day of the month of November, at the end of it, you have 50,000 words, which is a pretty decent start on a novel. Or in my case, it's almost all of a novel, because mysteriously, my books tend to wind up right about at 53, 54, 55,000 words, because I'm pretty much done at the end of November. But what that has done for me, again, having had that experience, that first night of writing, I do feel like I have no excuse to not get my words. I don't care what else is going on. So I've come back from, I now have a conference that I go to in Vegas every year in November. So I come back from a night of networking, high proof networking, and I either have to get my words down or I have to make them up the next day. And if you do that 2 or 3 days in a row, all of a sudden you're looking at having to write 10,000 words in a day, and that's not fun. Ask me how I know. My books are set all the way from Nova Scotia out to Bermuda and all the way around the Gulf Coast. When I was trying to write about the siege of Savannah, what I found looking at Google Maps was that the place where that happened is now subdivisions. It would do me no good to go and visit that place. It would mislead me. Other places, though, the landscape and so forth is relatively intact. I use all of the digital resources that we have to gain an impression of what things are like now. And if it feels like the way they are now is not what they were, then I go back to the period sources. I do, at this point, having written so many books, a lot of the basic background, again, the common stuff that applies across the colonies, I've already got it in my head. If you ask me medically, how do you treat this in 1780, I can give you an answer, and it pretty much applies across the colonies. What do you drink? Well, depending upon where you are, I can give you a pretty solid answer. What do you eat? Well, again, I can give you a pretty educated guess already without having to separately research that for each book. Specifically, what happened in this location? Now I'm having to do some reading and studying. And again, a lot of the stuff I find I have to solve a problem. I have to answer a question that has come to my readers or to my characters, and so those I'll do the research right there on the spot. And those are the nights where I'm up until 2 or 3 in the morning because I went down a rabbit hole. You have all of the founders' papers, all of their letters, all of their journals, all of that is just available to read. You have books that were written in the immediate aftermath of the revolution, where the author sits down and speaks to the people who were there and gets their recollections and gets their impressions and gets their biases and everything and puts those down, sets those down on the page so that I can understand where they're coming from. All of that's online. The specialized questions that you can get answers to are just amazing. In my book set in West Florida, my character ends up in Havana for a little while, and he encounters a lady of the evening on the streets of Havana. I wanted to give it a little bit more richness, so I wanted to find out what would she have smelled like. Obviously, she's probably fairly low class, so she's probably not very well bathed, and so that I can work that in. But if she wore perfume, what would that have smelled like? I found somebody who had written a research paper about the perfumery of the lower classes of the Caribbean in the late 18th century, and I got the exact answer that I needed 6 months after I published the book. One of the things that's really fascinating about writing in all these different colonies is the degree to which, yes, there were commonalities in the cultures, but these places all had their local cultures that were shaped by the Native Americans they encountered, shaped by the sorts of immigrants who had come to those places and settled them. They were shaped by the landscape, by the climate in each of these places, the sorts of crops that they could grow. So I try to reflect that a lot of times in the food that they're eating. So if you're on Bermuda, well, you're eating pepper sauce, which is kind of like a modern hot sauce. And if you're in Florida, you're probably eating fish and a lot of it. If you're in Nova Scotia, you're probably eating fish and a lot of it, but it's a different kind of fish. And if you're in Pennsylvania, you're eating all sorts of things that have come into that area from all over the world, because it was a hub of trade and communication with the world, as was New York, as was Boston. So if you set yourself the goal of writing about events in different colonies in the late 18th century, you pretty much immediately rule out the possibility of having continuous characters, because not many people moved around that much at that time. You might occasionally visit the next town over. If you were somebody extraordinary, you might go across the lines into the next colony. If you were some sort of a trader or something, you might touch, in a ship in several colonies. But very few people actually moved from place to place enough to where I could have a coherent story that would follow a particular character or set of characters. So I knew right from the beginning that all of the books were going to have to be standalone, which means, you know, I'm starting from a clean slate with every book, but I'm starting with a blank slate with every book. So when I'm trying to depict the life of somebody who lived 250 years ago, what makes that depiction feel real is to get right down into the nitty-gritty of how they lived their lives. In order to do that, I have to research, you know, what kind of tools did they use? What kind of food did they eat? What did they drink? How did they prepare that? I wind up reading a lot of, strangely, economic analyses to understand, okay, if somebody works all day in this career field, how prosperous are they going to be? Does that mean that they can afford a horse that you know they need for whatever other purpose, or is that a huge purchase that they have to plan for and save for, because of course they didn't have the savings and loan to go down and get a mortgage or get a car loan like we do today. You didn't really have horse loans. You might have a note where you signed a promissory note and then you had to pay on that. What I think is really valuable about that is it first of all, it brings you into that era, right? It makes it very clear when I'm reading a page of this book, I'm not in 20th century America, right? I'm in a different place. I'm in a different time. It's been said that the past is a foreign country. And so I really try to approach it as this is a different way of living than we have in our modern day. And so the things that are everyday to my characters are going to be hopefully fascinating to my readers. In the process of answering those questions for myself and for my readers, I wind up being able to impart a great deal of historical detail. In my current book that I'm working on, there's a set of people who were living in the place at the time who were from Italy and Greece, which is kind of a strange place to have immigrants from in colonial America. And so that enabled me to pull in a little tiny piece of some of the traditions from Napoli. And I just happened to have gone to Napoli a couple of years ago. So that was fun to be able to say, oh, I recognize that. And that actually has a place in this story. And being able to give little glimpses of that sort of thing, reflecting it, again, not as, oh my gosh, aren't they weird? But this is just how they solve the same problems that we face. You know, if you have a cough, how do you solve the problem back then versus how do we solve it today? If you're hungry, what do you do about it? Right? If you're worried about your child, how do you approach that? And how do you deal with it? Those are all, they're universal problems that we all have, no matter what era, what place we live. It's the solutions that are interesting.